Welcome back to the channel, beer perverts. I don't know about you, but I keep seeing the same phrase appear in different places. The craft beer gold rush is over. At first glance, that sounds like drama, like an industry collapsing, a bubble bursting, a full stop moment. But the more you look at it, the more it becomes clear that something slightly different is happening. Because this isn't really a collapse, it's a correction, a slowdown after one of the fastest periods of growth the US beer industry has ever seen. And what comes after that is the interesting part.
It's Monday, don't groan, don't fear. The Beard and Beer blog bloke is here. Talking nonsense, beard on show. Grab a brew and watch him go.
So what are we actually talking about here? Over roughly the last 15 to 20 years, the US went through an extraordinary expansion in craft brewing. Thousands of breweries opened. Tap rooms became a cultural fixture. Local beer became identity driven. And for a while, it felt like demand could keep up with supply. But that kind of growth rarely stays linear. And now, data from across the industry suggests something important. Openings have slowed, closures have increased, and overall growth has flattened to a much more mature market, which is where the phrase gold rush comes from. Because like most gold rushes, the early phase was about rapid expansion, and the later phase is about consolidation. To understand where we are now, you have to understand what drove the boom. Craft beer wasn't a production trend, it was a cultural shift. People wanted local identity, flavour diversity, alternatives to mass market beer, community-driven venues, and authenticity in consumption. And breweries responded quickly. In many cities, opening a brewery became almost a standard entrepreneurial path. Not like coffee shops or food trucks, but that kind of expansion has a side effect. Eventually, you saturate the market. Not because demand disappears, but because supply grows faster than consumption habits can shift. At a certain point, the US craft beer landscape started to change shape. Not drastically overnight, but structurally. More breweries meant more competition for tap handles, more pressure in retail space, more reliance on taproom traffic, tighter margins, and less differentiation between brands. And that's very important, because when everything becomes local, local stops being a differentiator. It becomes the baseline. One of the biggest shifts inside the boom was style concentration. Despite the diversity of craft beer on paper, a huge portion of sales were dominated by one category, IPA, especially hazy, heavy hopped versions. And while that drove growth for a time, it also created narrowing, because when too many breweries chase the same core demand, you end up with variation of the same product rather than true diversification, which is part of what we're seeing unwind now. So when industry writers talk about after the gold rush, they're not necessarily describing failure, they're describing maturity. A market that stops expanding rapidly, starts optimizing, consolidates weaker players, and stabilizes around sustainable models. And this is where things get interesting. Because in many cases, the breweries that survive this phase are not the ones that chase growth fastest. They're the ones that built stability early. So what replaces the boom phase? We're starting to see a few clear directions. Smaller, more focused brewery output, reduced experimental overload, stronger emphasis on taproom experience, more mid-strength and sessionable beers, and renewed interest in lagers and simplicity. And that last point is very important because it signals something cultural. After a period of intensity, people often return to balance. There's also a less romantic but important factor here: economics. Running a brewery is expensive. Ingredients, equipment, distribution, labour, energy costs, licensing. And when the growth slows, those fixed costs become more visible. So breweries adapt. Fewer SKUs, tighter core ranges, more taproom reliance, and stronger local focus. This isn't just taste driven, it's survival driven. This is where your interpretation matters, because depending on how you frame it, you can tell two stories. One story says, craft beer boom is over, and the other says, The industry is normalising after unsustainable growth. And both are partially true. But the data suggests something closer to a reset than a collapse. A correction after oversaturation. Not the end of craft beer, but the end of unchecked expansion. So when people talk about the craft beer gold rush ending, what they're really describing is a shift in phase, from expansion to consolidation, from novelty to stability, endless experimentation to selective refinement. And that doesn't necessarily make the scene worse. In some ways, it might make it more interesting again, because fewer breweries competing for attention often means more focus on what actually works. And I think that's the real story here. Not that craft beer peaked, but that it grew up.